It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Associate Professor David Pritchard from the University of Queensland, and really slash global citizen. So David has had fellowships across the world, in France especially, but the Netherlands, the UK, in addition to ARC-funded discovery projects that are underway right now. So if you're a future academic, I'm sure you could pick his brain on how to make the most of your career and get that sweet moolah. But he's, in addition to that, he's used that money to great effect in publishing on a wide array of topics in ancient Greek history, from the Athenian military to sport to funeral orations and oratory, and including meta-analysis of historiography of the ancient Greek world. So it's my pleasure to welcome him today. So our topic for today is the children of Athena, the armed forces of democratic Athens. So while David comes up here, I will share the screen behind me and make sure everything is in good shape. And there we go, we're all set. So please welcome David Pritchard.
Thank you very much. Well, I should get the right speech here. Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be giving another seminar in history and ancient history at the University of Newcastle. And I thank sincerely Dr. Ryan Strickler for his very kind introduction. And as well, I'd like to thank Dr. Sasha Davis for his organising of this series. Thank you very much. Everyone, I think that we can agree that Ryan is doing a fantastic job in rebuilding ancient history here at the University of Newcastle. All ancient historians across Australia wish him every success in this vital rebuilding. So well done, Ryan. Keep it up. So without further ado, I will begin with my lecture tonight. Okay. On the eve of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles famously advised the Athenians how they could win. This political leader reassured assemblygoers that they already had the required funds and military forces for victory. The first corps that Pericles mentioned was the 13,000 hoplites. The next two were the 1,200 strong cavalry and the 1,600 archers. The last military branch of which he spoke was a navy of 300 triremes. This paper's aim is to go behind Pericles' famous numbers. For each corps that he mentioned, it studies the legal status of corps members and their social background. The paper explores how they were recruited into their corps and subsequently mobilised for campaigns. It establishes each corps' history and specific organisation. Now, by comparing all military branches, this paper reveals the common practices and the common assumptions that the dēmos, the people, use to manage their armed forces. And I suppose that's a big claim from my research, is that nobody else has looked at all of these branches at the same time, and has allowed me to identify common practices and common assumptions, and to correct many shibboleths. Okay, so the first corps, hoplites. The hoplites of classical Athens were divided into 10 taxes or units, with one taxis for each of the 10 tribes. A unit was often simply called a phulea or tribe. The division of Athenians into tribes was a democratic reform of Cleisthenes. Soon after 506 BCE, Cleisthenes divided Attica into 3 regions. In each region, neighbouring dēmes were grouped together into 10 tritues, 10 thirds. The dēme was the word that the ancient Athenians used to describe a village or city suburb. A tribe had 1 tritus from each of the 3 regions. The Athenians believed that Cleisthenes had made them stronger militarily, and is likely, this is often overlooked, that a public army of hoplites was one of Cleisthenes' major reforms. Now, the hoplite, for those who are not ancient military buffs, the hoplite, of course, was was a heavily armed soldier, pictured here, who got his name from his shield, which was called a hoplon. So hoplon, hoplites. Now, Greek hoplites typically fought as part of a coalition army. When they did, those from Apollos, those from the city-state, formed a distinct contingent. A contingent from classical Athens was divided into phuli, into tribes. In land battles, Athenian hoplites therefore always fought beside fellow tribesmen. In the 480s, the Athenians created a board of 10 taxiarchs to command their hoplite taxates. It was the taxiarchos who subdivided his tribe's hoplites into lokoi, into subunits, and the number of subunits varied according to the size of the army. So the old theory that there one lokos for each tritus doesn't stand up anymore. Now, Athenian hoplites were the first branch of the armed forces that Pericles mentioned in his pre-war speech. And this is Thucydides, Book 2, Chapter 13, and I feel my entire career has been built around commenting on this chapter. I wrote a book about it, for example. Okay, so Athenian hoplites were the first branch of the armed forces that Pericles mentioned in his last pre-war speech. The 13,000 of them who were liable for active service were the largest corps after the Navy. Pericles distinguished them from, quote, the oldest, hoi presbytetoi, and the youngest, hoi neotetoi, and all the medics who were hoplites, unquote. This second group of hoplites normally manned only the city walls and Attica's forts. Hermann Hansen's pioneering work on ancient Greek demography establishes that there were 60,000 adult male citizens in 432-431, the eve of the Peloponnesian War. Certainly the youngest were the precursors of the late 4th century of Thebes. That is, the heavily armed soldiers in training who were 18 and 19 years old. The oldest were probably aged 50 to 59. Now, in the table of age distribution that Hansen uses, those aged between 20 and 49 represent 72.7% of adult males. In 431, the number of Athenians in this age band was 43,620, and I round up a whole person there. And this means that the 13,000 active service hoplites represented 29.8% of them, 29.8%. So this 30% came from quite prosperous families. By 433, 432, in fact, Athens began to pay hoplites the same time as sailors in the 470s. In 431, they were paid 1 drachma a day, but a hoplite had to purchase his own equipment. That could cost up to 100 drachmas if it included a bronze armour. In addition, another indication of his prosperity was that every hoplite owned a slave. So Thucydides assumes that every single Athenian hoplite owned a slave. The Athenians didn't think it was a good idea to arm slaves for land warfare. They will only use slaves in land warfare to carry the baggage. But it was a slave cost 200 drachmas. There were many poor Athenians who didn't even own a slave. So again, slave ownership shows that hoplites were prosperous. Now, the old German argument, I always like to say German argument in France because it gets a rise out of the audience. C'est une idée idiotique, you know, that sort of thing. Okay. The old German argument was that the telos, the income class of an Athenian, dictated the military branch in which he served. Okay, I should get the right slide. Okay. Now, a recap. In the 570s, Solon, the Athenian law reformer, had divided the Athenians into 4 such tele or income classes. And service as a hoplite, it was argued, was the legal requirement of every member of his third lowest telos. This class was called the zeugatai that you see here, the yokemen. They had to produce at least 200 medimnoi of agricultural produce. The top two classes were the 500 medimnoi men and the hip pace for horsemen. The German argument is that they provided ship captains, respectively, and horsemen for the cavalry corps. And then finally you had the thetes, the hired labourers, and the argument was that they could volunteer to be sailors or archers. Okay, things actually change in ancient history, and in the last 20 years, work on ancient Greek agriculture has refuted this old German argument. In particular, the work of Hans van Vies has shown very clearly that a zeugites needed 8.7 hectares of land to qualify for that income class. As there were only 96,000 hectares of arable land in Attica, there wasn't enough land for all the hoplites to be zeugatai, and Van Vies's calculation suggests that, good that you're sitting down, on the eve of the Peloponnesian War, half the hoplites came from the top three census classes, and the other half were thetes, came from the lowest census class. So this old German argument is kind of on its last legs, and that's a significant development in military history. Instead, I would argue that an Athenian probably chose whether he would be a hoplite, an archer, or a sailor when, as an 18-year-old, he was registered as a citizen in his deme. And if he decided to be a hoplite, we know that this choice was written next to his name in the register of citizens that the demarch held. A demarch, of course, was kind of like the town mayor of a village or city suburb in ancient Athens. Now, before a campaign, each taxiarch drew up a katalogos, a conscription list, and he got the names for his conscription list by asking the demarchs in his tribe for the names, and he then collated them all and produced a list. So it's the deme records that are critical for hoplite recruitment. Now, each tribe's conscription list was displayed under the statue of its eponymous hero in Athens's agora or civic centre, and many of you would know that the statues of the tribal demigods there were the notice board of Athenian democracy. So the conscription list with hoplites was posted there. On display too was the date when hoplites needed to muster and where they needed to do so. Often the muster place would be the athletics field of the Lyceum, just outside the city walls, but sometimes they even mustered it, for example, in the assembly place of a democracy on the Pnyx. And in both of these locations, we've discovered horoi, boundary markers for tritues, for thirds, saying that a third of one tribe begins and a third of another tribe ends. So we find tritues markers in both locations. And the most plausible explanation is that these third markers, of these markers for tribal thirds, were used for the roll call of the conscription list before people went on campaign. Okay, moving on. So the second call that Pericles mentioned in his last assembly speech before the Peloponnesian War were the cavalry. In 431, it consisted of 1,000 hippae, horsemen, and 200 hippotoxetai, 200 mounted archers. Now the horsemen, always they were always Athenian citizens, and they were divided into 10 tribes as well. Each tribe of 100 was commanded by a phylarchos or phylarch, and 2 hipparchs commanded the force as a whole. Now, hippae were conscripted for a campaign in the same way, just as hoplites were, namely their name was put on a tribal catalogos. But what's different is that the phylarchs had access to a central record of horsemen. Because there were only 1,200 cavalry corps members, they could maintain a central list, but there were 13,000 hoplites. Athens simply didn't have enough public servants to maintain a central list of hoplites. So there was a central list of horsemen. Now, the cavalry corps was created in the 450s. Okay, that's pretty certain. But it was expanded massively at some point. And we get a date by which the expansion happens from the Parthenon. So the Parthenon finished in 438, 437 BC. And let's think about the Parthenon, controversial topic, the Parthenon frieze. We think about the Parthenon frieze. The Parthenon frieze depicts the Pompeia procession of the great Panathenaea, and the cavalry had a huge part in the procession and depicted extensively on the Parthenon frieze. And here you have bits of the Parthenon frieze, the bit on the left in London, the bit on the right in Athens. Why is it quite why did that happen? But people often overlook the fact that the horsemen on the Parthenon frieze are divided into 10 groups, and each of the groups has a slightly different uniform. So we probably have a depiction of the 10 units of the expanded cavalry corps on the Parthenon frieze. Now, serving as a horseman was much more demanding than being a hoplite. Each horseman had to buy his own horse and a horse for his slave groom, and the 2 horses probably cost 500 drachmas. In addition, being a horseman, full-time commitment. You had to be ready for immediate deployment. You had to be training all the time, because it's hard to ride a horse without stirrups. It's hard to discharge weapons from a horse without stirrups as well. The training took place in the urban centre or in the athletics fields just outside the city walls. Now, to get the recruits for the expanded corps, the democracy introduced 2 subsidies. One was a setting up loan to help the horseman buy his horses and his kit, and another was a wage of 2 drachmas a day. And I spoke about horses in my early lecture today and horse feed, but we know that a horse probably ate 1 drachma of food per day. So a horseman had 1 drachma left over to take home. Okay. Importantly, Solon's income classes played no role in the recruitment of horsemen. And this, so when we find the word hippes in classical Athenian sources, that word means either cavalry members or members of the second highest Solonian income class. The word is never used to describe both groups at the same time. Instead, serving as a horseman was a legal requirement of, to quote Xenophon in this fantastic treatise on being an Athenian cavalry commander, quote, those who are most able in terms of money and physical capacity, unquote. Indeed, and this is important, hipparchs could compel 20-year-olds who met these criteria to join up. And there's a very important reason why we have the first criterion, those who are most able in terms of money. Because, let's think about it, 500 drachmas for horses, that was 5 times more than it would cost to be a hoplite. It was the equivalent of 2 years of wages for a skilled labourer. The state may have lent you the money to buy your horses, but when you retired after 10 to 15 years, you had to pay it back. You had to pay back 500 drachmas and your horses were useless. And so being a horseman only attractive to those young men who knew that they were going to inherit a great deal of money, i.e. very wealthy individuals. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that Aristophanes, the famous comic poet in this play, assumes that the 1,000 hippes all belonged to the elite. So that's what he assumes. They're all kaloika agathoi in this play. And you'd be relieved to know that demographic modelling seems to confirm Aristophanes' belief. So horsemen were aged between 20 and 32.5 years. And in the age distribution table that Hansen uses, they are 37.2% of adult males. In 431, there were, and I know you're dying for this number, in this age band, 22,320, rounded up to the whole person, of which 1,000 horsemen were 4.5%. 4.5%. Now that's significant because the best estimate we have for the size of the wealthy or the elite in classical Athens is 5%. And so it looks like simply being wealthy meant you had to be a horseman in Athens from the late 330s at the latest. Finally, the hippotoxetae. The horses of the hippotoxetae were owned by the state. Hippotoxetae were always paid a lot more than regular horsemen, and this confirms the belief that they were poorer than regular horsemen. They're probably poor Athenians serving in this role. The hippotoxetae are abolished really during the Corinthian War, so they actually don't really survive the Peloponnesian War. Okay. So now we get on to my, I'm supposed to be a dispassionate military historian, but I have my favourites. My favourite corps, the archers. And so people always overlook that Athens in the 5th century had Greece's only professional archer corps. Remarkable. What's also remarkable is that my published study on the archers is the first such study of this corps in over a century as well. So the archers have kind of been almost completely neglected for no good reason at all in military history of the ancient world. Okay, so the third corps that Pericles mentioned in 431 were the 1,600 archers. The Athenians had no archers at the Battle of Marathon in 490, but they had archers at the Battle of Salamis in 480. Okay, so the archer corps was created in the 480s. That's, we simply know that. Now, how do we date it? So, in the late 480s, the Athenian politician Themistocles famously convinced the dēmos to create Greece's largest public navy. And after this shipbuilding, the Athenians had 200 triremes, so just an enormous fleet. And it strikes me that archers could do a lot of good work on these new warships. They could kill enemy rowers from a distance, but no less importantly, they could protect the rowers. So you can imagine that the dēmos said, fantastic, 200 more warships. And then someone said, but that means that we have to row the ships. And they thought, oh yes, let's get some protection. So it's likely, I think, that the archer corps was created to leverage the military advantage that dēmos wanted from their much bigger navy. That's the best explanation that I have. Now, archers were definitely thetes, right? Different from the lowest Solonian income class, because we'll see that they joined because they were really, really poor. But there's no evidence that that membership of the thetes class determined their membership of the corps. Rather, I think we need to assume that they simply volunteered to join this corps as non-elite Athenians volunteered to join the hoplite corps. The dēmos created a board of toxarchoi, of archer corps commanders, and because it was a corps of 1,600, these commanders could maintain a central record of archers, and they drew on this central record to produce conscription lists of archers. So this is significant. It means that conscription is a common practice across the terrestrial branches of the Athenian armed forces. But in other respects, the archer corps was different. Many, perhaps even most, many corps members rather, were metics. They were resident aliens. And as tribal membership in Athens was a prerogative of citizenship, the fact that they were medic archers meant that the archer corps could not be organised along tribal lines. And indeed, it's not clear to me that the archer corps even had regular units. Now, this is where it gets complicated. So the dēmos understood the military advantages of archers, right? They said archers are really important, let's spend big bucks on them. But they didn't hold archers in high regard. And the first reason they didn't hold them in high regard was that they thought that they were cowards. So in Athenian public discourse, a brave man bears kindunoi, bears dangers in spite of the risk to his life. Okay, so bears dangers, risks his life. That's what a brave man does. But what do archers do? They fire their arrows from a safe distance. If the other side get too close, they run away. So archers kind of are out of sync with the popular definition of courage. Archers run away, but they're out of sync with the popular definition of courage. And public speakers and public playwrights, like Euripides here, pointed that out all the time. So for the dēmos, archers, they're on the nose, they're cowards. And the second reason is that the dēmos saw archery as predominantly a barbarian mode of combat. Indeed, I would say that many, perhaps even most, we've got explicit evidence of this, most of the medic archers in classical Athens were barbarians. They were non-Greeks. In addition, Athens had a police force of 300 barbarians, and these dēmosioi, these public slaves, were armed as archers. And finally, the Persians, the despised Persians, they're archers, right? Okay, so archery, that's what barbarians do. So this is the second reason why archers were on the nose. So that's the case then. Archers are on the nose. Archers are, looked down upon by the Athenian dēmos. Matthew Trundle, this sadly late Matthew Trundle, a really nice ancient historian that died from cancer in his 50s, right? But late Matthew Trundle had a really good question. Why did Athenian citizens serve in the archer corps? Why? And you could say they served in the archer corps because it was cheaper than the hoplite corps. That might be an explanation. But the same was the case with the navy, because a sailor needed to provide a cushion and an oar loop, which weren't very expensive, right? So a poor Athenian could serve in the navy. And in addition, the Athenian dēmos held sailors in much higher regard, seeing them as courageous as hoplites. So why didn't poor people just join the navy? Why did they join the despised archer corps? And the explanation is the employment conditions. So look, I had lots of traumatic experiences at school camps involving archery, when I was sort of shoot my foot or my best friend or something like that. So archery is really difficult. It's a perishable skill. So to be an archer, you need to practice it all the time. The Athenians wanted their archers to be always ready for an immediate deployment, right? And so we know that they asked the same thing of the cavalry corps, and the cavalry were paid on a full-time basis. Now, we have evidence that archers were also paid on a full-time basis, right? So poor Athenians joined the archer corps because they needed their military service to be their full-time jobs, okay? So there was a huge economic opportunity for archers. But this was also really, really expensive. It cost over 100 talents per year, 10% of the Athenian budget. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens didn't have the money. So the archer corps doesn't survive the Peloponnesian War. After 80 years, that's it. It's disbanded. Okay. So the last military branch that Pericles mentioned in his pre-war speech were the 300 triremes. And it was the duty of all citizens to fight for the state. And in 432, 431, 2/3 of them met this duty by serving in the navy. The 200-strong crew of the standard Athenian trireme was divided into 4 groups. 2 groups were the 4 toxotai and the 10 epibatai, and the 3rd group consisted of the 6 petty officers. These officers were called collectively per huperesia, the assistants or the help, because they assisted or helped the ship captain. And the 4th group were the 170 nautai. The trireme got its name from the 3 levels of the benches on which these rowers sat. And a trireme had, and no doubt you're waiting for this, a trireme had 62 top bench, 54 middle bench, and 54 low bench rowers. So there you go. Now, a trireme crew was led by a triarchos, a triarch, and what made this command different from other forms of military service was the cost. So the state paid the wage, the misthos of sailors, but triarchoi, who were one of the best sailors, had to pay bonuses on top of that wage. In addition, at sea, triarchs had to pay for ship repairs and to have to pay for replacement rowers. And that replacement rowers, it's not like they died or anything, but they often would go, oh, time to go home. This is not very unpleasant. See you around. Okay. So they had to get replacement rowers. And I've worked it out. A triarchy cost 4,436 drachmas on average. So that's about 17 or 18 kilograms of silver. It's a great deal of money. And this explains why the dēmos made the triarchy one of the public services that the elite had to perform. Each year, the generals conscripted elite Athenians to be triarchs. And if you were conscripted and served as a triarch, it's an important point. The individual is exempted from doing so again or performing any military service for 2 years. Okay, there's an exemption for 2 years. This meant that the Athenian elite alternately served in the navy and the land army. So that's a very striking pattern. Now, in order to keep track of his expenses, a triarch, with the aid of his purser, kept a detailed crew list. Okay, a detailed crew list. Scholars have often doubted it. For example, the late great Kurt Raffler doubted this point. So in 405, 404, the dēmos honoured the sailors of the 8 triremes that escaped from the final military debacle of the Peloponnesian War at Agos. And they did so by setting up a monument with their crew lists. So I think this is one of the most amazing inscriptions from classical Athens. Okay, so these are the guys who escaped from Agos. What survives of this stela provides a crew list of 4 of these warships that escaped the debacle and participated in the last stand of Athens before the Spartan siege was tightened. So epibatai were regular members of the hoplite corps who were serving in a fleet. While these Marines were usually volunteers, there still needed to be a roll call to make sure that all of the volunteers were honouring their pledge to serve. And for the sake of this roll call, the Athenians, an epibatai, I should post on my slides, an epibatai, an elite epibates, and it's an elite epibates. Okay, and then you've got the naval harbour at Zia. So in the naval harbour, we've found more triremes markers, these markers for tribal thirds, which we'll probably use to as a roll call for the roll call of Marines before they went on the ships. Now, if they went on the ships in tribal order, okay, we would expect to see that on the Athenian naval catalogue. And we can test this idea because on that catalogue, you've got the name of an Athenian citizen and his dean name. And in classical Athens, the deem name determined your tribal membership. And so with these deem names, you can assign people to different tribes. And yes, I've spent weeks of my life assigning names to tribes. And when you do that, you find that the epibatae on each ship come from a wide range of tribes. So they may have stood behind the tutuas markers for the roll call, but after that, they just went with their mates and acquaintances and so forth and so on. It was a dog's breakfast after that. No tribal order of epibatae at all. Now, the employment of resident aliens in the archer corps meant that the archers on triremes were not organised by tribes. Tribal membership, again, being a prerogative of citizenship. Now, this gets a bit technical here. So, the most important petty officer on a trireme was the kubernetes, the helmsman, and very technical, and it also involves hand acting as well. So he controlled the steering oars, and so with the help of the proirates, the bow officer, navigated the trireme, and these two petty officers had 5 deckhands each. And the orders of the kubernetes were relayed to the rowers by the kalestes, the rowing master, come on, row faster, who along with the auletes, the aulos or pipe player, set the rowing speed. And the final 2 petty officers were the naupegos, the shipwright, and the pentekontakos, the purser. Without per huperesia, a trireme could not function. The classical Athenians therefore preferred to reserve these indispensable roles for fellow citizens. You can imagine them as another little corps, actually, of the Athenian forces. Now, their mobilisation had 2 stages. In the first, the state conscripted the required number of petty officers. And the second stage saw the triarchs compete with each other to hire the best of these conscripts by offering bonuses. So, okay. Because this second stage ruled out any role for the Cleisthenic tribes, it is unsurprising that each huperesia, each group of petty officers on IG 131032, the famous naval catalogue, came from non-contiguous tribes. So no tribal pattern for these guys either. Now the rowers were never formally recruited into the armed forces. Rather, they simply turned up in the Piraeus when a fleet was just about to depart. Triarchs competed with each other to hire the best of these volunteers. Now, most of the Nautae whom they hired were fellow Athenians. That's been doubted by Vincent Gabrielson, but I think Vincent is wrong on this point, actually. Indeed, from 433 to 426, there were normally 50% more Athenians in this branch of the armed forces than were required for the fleets of any particular year. In spite of this, a triarch always had to hire non-citizens in order to find his 170 rowers. Most of these foreign rowers were metics, but others were simply non-resident foreigners from the hundreds of Greek city-states in the Athenian Empire. Now, while the Athenians never used slaves in land battles, they found that giving them an oar was safe. Therefore, triarchs also regularly employed slave rowers. And that's not my finding, that's a finding of Peter Hunt, among others, as a very significant finding indeed. Now, since these commanders relied on non-citizen rowers, many Athenian nautae clearly did not row every year. This suggests that their service pattern was similar to hoplites and triarchs. After serving in a fleet, they had a rest for a year or more. The use of the market to mobilise rowers and the non-citizen status of many of them ruled out tribal organisation. Therefore, on each of the triremes of RG 131032, that famous naval catalogue, there were citizen rowers, astoi nautoi, from almost every Pleistonic tribe. Okay. Now, my conclusion is super brief, but it covers a huge amount of ground. But I leave the conclusions on the screen, so I'm happy to discuss them at greater length in the Q&A. Okay, here goes. So, in all military branches, Solon's income classes played no regular roles. So that's kind of really significant. It was simply the obligation of every citizen to serve in one corps or another. Non-elite Athenians were free to choose the corps that best suited them. Elite citizens did not have the same choice. The dēmos made it compulsory for them to serve as triremes. As young men, they were legally obliged to join the cavalry corps. Telos membership therefore had no impact on an Athenian's military obligation, nor the branch in which he served. Conscription was also not limited to the top three income classes. For example, as many hoplites came from Solon's fourth telos, their conscription lists always included thetes. The dēmos did not expect to fight all the time. In their eyes, a citizen who did so periodically fulfilled his duty to fight for the state. And that's really significant, and that helps to explain the military power of 5th century Athens. Therefore, they granted hoplites who had recently served a legal right to arrest. They judged it enough for Athenian rowers to serve periodically. For every corps, the Athenians created written records of those corps members who were on a campaign. For the land forces, corps or unit commanders maintained these records. For the navy, this responsibility generally fell to the triremes. Finally, tribal organisation was a great deal less common in the armed forces, because membership of a tribe was a right that only citizens enjoyed. Those corps that had non-citizens as members could not be so organised. The only Athenians who fought alongside fellow tribesmen were hoplites and cavalrymen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have, a little over 10 minutes for questions. I might use my prerogative as chair to lead the way. So do you reckon, is there any chance that your conclusions here are a result of the later evidence? So is there a chance that under Solon, for example, this may have been very much related to the military, but then under later reforms, it becomes less of an issue, maybe more democratized?
Yeah, that's it. It's a very good point, and of course and there's huge scholarship on the Solonian reforms and what they meant. But for me, I think that's quite unlikely. I mean, I've got a PhD student tied to my ARC project working on warfare in archaic Athens, and I think the working assumption that he and I still have is that warfare in archaic Athens was small scale, and it was largely a private activity. And there were very, very limited public practices and public institutions ordering it and controlling it, actually. And that most soldiers in archaic Athens were volunteers who came from the elite. So given that world of private warfare, small-scale warfare, small numbers of combatants, very weak state institutions, lots of initiative for elite Athenians who wage wars, it's unlikely that there will be a global system for saying, okay, you now have to fight, you now have to do this. I think that's unlikely. Yeah.
Session. This was really interesting, and I felt questions, most of which show my ignorance of the period. But it was really interesting to sort of see the role of resident aliens in this, because on one hand, they seem to be trusted or obligated to participate in the defense of Athens. And on the other hand, they seem to always be put in fairly relegated roles as archers, as defenders on the walls, but not in direct combat and so on. So should we see their military contribution as a gesture of their inclusion or as a gesture of their exclusion?
Yeah, let's see. So look, so the it's a very complex question, but let's see. So in a sense, metics were both included in the state and also kept in the margins of the state and reminded of their subordinate status. Okay, so that's the thing about metic status. It was created to give non-citizen residents some rights. Metics had access to the courts, but also so that the state could draw on their labour and their money to help Athens be glorious. And one way to do that was to conscript them in an emergency. Another one was to accept them as serving in some parts of the armed forces as volunteers if they wanted to do so. Yeah. But look, I think that's the Athenian dēmos did many good things, but it was great they actually created this metic status, but they guarded their own citizen prerogatives very closely, and they were kind of really mean-spirited about it, in that they were given a choice to enfranchise the metics who fought to restore the democracy in 404, and they gave these metics citizenship for a couple of weeks and then changed their mind and took it back off them. So the dēmos was, pretty ungenerous in that regard.
So, thank you. I can't recall the reference, but something about a ship commanded bemoaning the cost of rigging, trying to break him financially. Yeah,
it's Demosthenes 50 against Pericles, I think, and the commander in question is Apollodorus. It's just this fantastic speech, and Apollodorus, son of an emancipated slave who became a metic, and because his father was such a great banker and donated so much money to Athens, the dēmos did say, and now you and your son can be a citizen. And Apollodorus goes from being a metic to a citizen, and then his first thing he does as an adult, it's kind of like, I'm just going to show I'm a citizen. So he spends an absolute mozza on his trireme, gold gilt, the best rose, and crack rigging and stuff like that. And then when it comes time to hand over the ship to the replacement triarch, the replacement triarch says, listen, there's no way in the world I'm taking this overly expensive ship, no matter rod for your own back, I'm going home. So that's speech.
Just thinking of other combatants which may not have had sort of formal sort of recognition, but Peltas, and there's various others who I would imagine these would be drawn from the people.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. I've done some work on that. So particularly in the first phase of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians used a mobilisation in mass, pandeme is the adverb that Thucydides often uses, and they simply marched out of Athens with the entire land army and all other able-bodied free residents of Athens and Attica. They invaded Megara or Thebes, and they often used these big masses to build fortifications or ravage the territory of a neighbour unchallenged. But Thucydides makes clear that often, the sub-hoplite, Athenian residents who go out with that would bring their own slings and rocks and javelins and things like be lightly armed. Good idea to have a rock in case the Theban cavalry bears down on you. So we know that. We know too that in 5th century Athens used some mercenary peltas quite effectively, and then peltas become very significant in the 4th century, and I think that's a consequence of the demise of the archer corps. So with the archer corps, the Athenians in fact deploy the archers, but with no archer corps, they employ peltasts instead in high numbers. Yeah, yes, yeah.
Swift runners,
And archers too, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah.
That was really interesting, and I actually found both the numbers absolutely fascinating. But with the periodic service that's in your conclusion, would there be an economic aspect to that? Obviously, if you strip your entire city of all your able-bodied citizens, some of them aren't coming back, and you're completely ruined your city's ability to run as a city, but also your birth rate. So you're not going to be able to replace them.
Yeah, let's see. So the birth rate, first of all. So the Peloponnesian War had a terrible impact on Athenian demography. So Athens had 60,000 adult male citizens in 431, but it only had about 25,000 at the end of the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was a disaster for Athenian demography. But your point's a really good one. So I think that, and I don't think I think I'm the person who makes this point actually. So the Athenians in the 5th century, in the good days of the 5th century, served every 2nd or 3rd year. They didn't serve every year. And that's very, very significant, because Athens is an imperial power that fights multiple wars almost every year. And that would be impossible to do, I think, if you had to mobilize your entire population for all those wars. If you can give people take things in turn, it means that the Athenian war making is much more sustainable. So it explains why the Athenians waged constant war in the classical period in 2 out of 3 years in the 5th century and 3 out of 4 years in the 4th century, because they took it in turns. That's quite significant.
Spoke about there being like a hierarchy of like respect towards soldiers and archers.
Yep.
Do you think that there was more of a respect given to those that served on the ships, like on boats, compared to those archers?
Look, it's a very good point, and I think there's some truth in that the Athenians, sometimes the Athenians, make distinctions between different naval personnel, like they're the archers, they're the marines, they're the petty officers, that's the triereme, they're the rowers. We see that in the naval catalogue, but often they don't. Often they describe all of them as nautai. And if they're all described as nautai, that's significant. It means that everyone on the ship gets some of the reflected glory of sailors. There, of course, is a debate about the standing of sailors in classical Athens, but that's one of the other aspects of my historiography on them. I hope I've demonstrated that sailors were esteemed as highly as hoplites in classical Athens, and you see that across literary genres. But it's a good point, and you're right.
We've got a couple more minutes if there's any questions.
I guess just on archers, since
Yep.
they're sort of key interest. You know that they're full time.
Yeah.
So might they be doing other functions, such as policing?
Let's see. So no. So we do know that they're full time. We've actually it's a little bit complicated, but pseudo Aristotle's Constitution of the Athenians describes them as full time actually. But so the police force were different. The police force were different, and the police force, the Athenians didn't like performing roles where they had to kill fellow citizens or rough up fellow citizens. It's better to get public slaves to do that. And so the police force were public slaves. So they were public slaves that had a very good life, but they were public slaves, and that's different from the regular archer corps. And you need to be careful. There's an inscription that some people have linked to the archer corps, but it's an inscription that talks about the police. So they're different.
So what might they be doing to warrant the full-time employment, do you think?
Well, let's see. So when you read Thucydides, they're serving in the armed forces all the time. I mean, they're serving in the Navy all the time. So if Athens, mobilizes 100 triremes just on regular, and they're all just regular Athenian triremes, that's 400 archers. If it's 150 triremes, it's 600 archers, right? And then on top of that, if you read Thucydides carefully, he's always talking about small detachments of archers being sent on terrestrial campaigns. So the fact that the Athenians actually had them there all the time meant that they used them all the time in the Navy and also in terrestrial campaigns. So it's really striking that when you read Thucydides, because they've been ignored, they're there all the time, and then they disappear, and Athens have to turn elsewhere for light troops.
Given that they were using low poundage bows, their influence on the battle may not have been particularly strong. Snakes here in so might they have had other roles on campaign to speculate, scouting, and some others?
Yeah, let's see. So look,
they're almost professional.
yes. So they let's see. So archers and cavalry were very important for protection of hoplites on the flanks, for protection of hoplites before pitched battles, and very important during the rout as well.
Yeah.
Archers are also significant if the Athenians are fighting other light troops. And so in Demosthenes' campaign in Anatolia, in the Archidamian War, the final battle went okay until the archers ran out of arrows and the archer commander was killed, and then the Athenian hoplites were massacred by peltasts.
Good, so for one more question, we might wrap things up. Sorry, for the archers, was it like a specific training regimen, or was it a sort of universal way that they were trained, or was it dependent on, let's say, like different groups and that might have been certain other?
Okay, let's see. So look, it's very hard to say because we've got, for example, cavalry corps is similar size, also full-time, or same sort of price tag. And we've got lots, because cavalry corps or rich guys, we've got lots of treatises, lots of information, lots of depictions of them. We have much less information about the archers because they were less highly regarded. They were really poor people, and most of them could have been non-Athenian as well. So we have much less information. So we need to hypothesize a bit, but I think we can hypothesize that the corps probably did also engage in regular training, and that was important to make sure that it was a professional force that could be effective in the field as well. So just, the cavalry corps trained sort of longer time training. I think we can imagine the archer corps doing the same thing in the athletics fields and the naval harbours of Athens. But thank you, it's a good question.
Well, please join me in thanking one more time David for his wonderful talk. And I'd also like to thank Sasha for yet another successful seminar series and keeping things moving along and recruiting such a wide variety of disciplines, including cutting out some time for us ancient historians. So we appreciate that. So this is the last talk for this semester's seminar series. We'll take a well-deserved break, and we'll resume again in July or August. Yeah, I guess the first week of August. With our own Ian Berger, who will be talking about his trip to Greece as part of the Odyssey Foundation Scholarship. So have a great break, and we'll see you again on the other side.